Have you ever noticed how the silence didn't start after she pulled away, but before it? Quietly, almost invisibly. You've probably been replaying every moment in your head, questioning what you said, what you missed, or why the shift seemed to come out of nowhere. But here's the truth most men are never told. She didn't pull away randomly. Fear was already there. Fear of closeness, fear of your calm, fear of what your steady presence asked her to face within herself. This isn't about blame or regret. It's about understanding the unseen emotional tension that builds long before distance appears. And when you stop chasing reassurance and start observing clearly, you step into a deeper kind of power, one rooted in composure, self-respect, and control. Let's break this down together. If this speaks to where you are right now, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's continue this journey. Number 1. Fear doesn't start loud. When she pulled away, it felt sudden, like something snapped without warning. One day, the connection felt warm and familiar, and the next, distant and unsure. But fear almost never announces itself with a dramatic exit. It works quietly, patiently, beneath the surface. Long before she stepped back, fear was already shaping how she responded, how close she allowed things to get, and how safe intimacy felt to her. Fear shows up in subtle ways. It hides inside hesitation, in jokes that deflect seriousness, in moments where she changes the subject just as things deepen. Sometimes it appears as irritation over small things, or a sudden need for space right when emotional closeness increases. These aren't random mood swings. They're early warning signs of an inner conflict, one part of her wanting connection, the other wanting protection. If you replay the timeline honestly, you'll likely notice it. The way she grew quieter after meaningful moments. The way vulnerability made her uneasy instead of calm. The way things felt good, yet slightly unstable at the same time. That instability wasn't caused by you pushing too hard. It came from fear being activated by the very thing that should feel safe: closeness. The Stoics paid close attention to this process. They believed emotions don't overpower us all at once. They gain influence when we fail to notice them early. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that inner disturbances begin as small impressions, thoughts we accept without questioning, until they quietly guide our actions. By the time behavior changes, the emotion has already won several private battles. She didn't make a sudden decision. She followed a fear she had been rehearsing internally for a long time. What's important here is this: her fear wasn't created by one conversation, one mistake, or one missed moment. It was triggered by what connection required of her. Real intimacy asks for emotional exposure, consistency, and the willingness to risk being hurt. For someone who hasn't made peace with that vulnerability, fear feels like self-preservation. Pulling away feels safer than staying present. That's why she didn't explain it clearly. Fear doesn't like to be named. It prefers silence, ambiguity, and distance. Instead of saying, "I'm afraid," she obeyed the feeling without examining it. Quietly, instinctively, and when fear leads, clarity disappears. Understanding this changes how you carry the situation. You stop blaming yourself for not saying the perfect thing. You stop imagining that one more message or one more explanation would have fixed it. The real struggle wasn't happening between you and her, it was happening inside her. Stoicism teaches you to recognize that distinction. You focus on what's within your control, your composure, your self-respect, your ability to remain steady even when someone else retreats. Her fear shaped her actions, but it doesn't have to shake your foundation. When you see the truth clearly, you don't chase what pulled away in silence. You stand grounded, aware that not all distance is rejection. Sometimes it's unexamined fear, choosing the easiest escape. Number 2. The mask was slipping. Maybe what scared her wasn't you, but what she felt starting to unravel inside herself. At the beginning, everything felt easy. She could show up effortlessly, stay light, avoid depth, and move at a pace that didn't ask too much of her. But over time, your presence changed the atmosphere. Not because you pushed, not because you demanded answers, but because you were steady. And steadiness has a way of quietly raising the bar without ever saying a word. You might have noticed it in small moments. The way she shifted the subject when conversations turned honest. How she grew distant after moments of emotional closeness. How she seemed most comfortable when things stayed undefined. That's not coincidence. That's someone sensing that the version of themselves they've been presenting can't hold up much longer. The mask starts to slip when consistency enters the room. This is where understanding fear matters. Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. Like pulling back just when things feel real. Like telling herself she needs space when what she really needs is clarity she hasn't built yet. When she realized that being around you required more honesty, more emotional maturity, more alignment than she was prepared to give, her nervous system chose retreat over growth. The Stoics spoke directly to this inner conflict. Epictetus taught that most suffering comes from living out of alignment with who we truly are. And when someone enters your life who is aligned, who knows their values, their direction, their emotional footing, it creates contrast. Your calm didn't criticize her. It didn't corner her. It simply reflected something back to her that she hadn't resolved yet. And that reflection can feel threatening. Not because you're wrong, but because staying would mean confronting parts of herself she's been avoiding. It would mean choosing growth instead of familiarity, responsibility instead of comfort. And not everyone is ready for that choice, even if they care. So when you look back and wonder why she pulled away, understand this. It wasn't random. It wasn't sudden. Fear was already there, waiting for a moment, when pretending stopped working. You didn't cause it. You revealed it. And that's an important distinction. If you're watching this and questioning whether you should have been less serious, less grounded, less yourself, don't. The Stoics never advised shrinking to keep others comfortable. They taught self-respect, clarity, and inner order. And sometimes, living that way doesn't push people away. It simply shows them where they're not ready to stand yet. Before we continue, take a moment to sit with what you just heard. If any part of this reflected your experience, let that recognition land instead of rushing past it. This is where clarity begins. If this resonates, support the channel by liking the video and leave a comment sharing what stood out to you, or simply type "clarity over comfort" in the comments. Let's move forward with that awareness. Number 3. Your stability exposed her chaos. You didn't try to fix her. You didn't rush to rescue the moment or soften every uncomfortable pause. You stayed grounded, steady, and emotionally consistent. And that kind of presence is rare. Rare enough that it can quietly shake someone who's still living in emotional turbulence. What unsettled her wasn't something you said or did, it was how little you needed to react. Your calm wasn't passive. It was structured. And structure, to someone used to disorder, can feel threatening. Here's what that looks like in real life. When tension showed up, you didn't spiral. When uncertainty appeared, you didn't chase clarity at any cost. When she pulled back emotionally, you didn't panic or try to negotiate her feelings. You remained the same person. That consistency creates safety for someone who's ready, but pressure for someone who isn't. Because suddenly, the chaos they've learned to manage doesn't work anymore. There's nothing to push against, nothing to provoke, nothing to control. The Stoics understood this deeply. They believed that inner order is more powerful than emotional persuasion. A man who governs himself doesn't need to govern others. And when you live that way, you stop participating in emotional games without ever announcing it. You don't withdraw to punish. You don't engage to soothe insecurity. You simply act from principle. That's not coldness. That's clarity. But to someone who hasn't built that clarity inside themselves, it can feel like standing next to a calm ocean while their own mind is a storm. So when she began to pull away, it wasn't random. The fear was already there, sitting quietly beneath the surface. Fear of being seen too clearly. Fear of being expected to rise to a level of honesty, stability, or self-awareness she wasn't prepared for. Your presence didn't create that fear. It exposed it. Your discipline highlighted the gap between who she was and who she sensed she'd have to become around you. And that's the part most people miss. You didn't destabilize her world. You didn't overwhelm her with demands. You simply stayed rooted in yourself. And sometimes, that's enough to make someone step back. Not because you lacked warmth, but because you carried a kind of calm that requires growth to stay near. Number 4. Closeness triggered survival mode. When someone has unhealed emotional wounds, real closeness can feel unsafe. Not because you did anything, but because the heart remembers where it bled. And that memory doesn't live in logic, it lives in the body. You may have felt it the moment things started to deepen. The conversations felt more honest. The connection felt more real. And right there, when intimacy stopped being abstract and started becoming personal, something in her shifted. Not loudly, quietly. That's how fear usually moves. What looked like sudden distance was often her nervous system trying to regain control. When closeness increases, so does vulnerability. And for someone who has been hurt before, vulnerability doesn't register as warmth, it registers as risk. So instead of leaning in, she pulled back just enough to feel safe again. Less texting, more hesitation, a subtle emotional wall. Not because you crossed a line, but because being close meant she could lose something that mattered. There's a moment many people don't talk about, the moment when consistency feels heavier than chaos. You showed up the same way. You didn't create emotional highs and lows. You didn't disappear to provoke longing. You were steady. And that steadiness can be unsettling to someone whose past taught them that connection always ends in pain. As Seneca taught, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. She may have imagined the ending before the middle was ever finished. The fear of losing you, needing you, or being fully seen may have felt so intense that creating distance seemed like the only way to breathe. From a Stoic perspective, this isn't about chasing or fixing. It's about understanding what was always there beneath the surface. Fear didn't arrive because of something you did wrong. It surfaced because the connection became real enough to expose it. You didn't trigger her wounds, you revealed them. And when someone isn't ready to face what closeness awakens, survival mode takes over. Distance feels safer than growth. Control feels safer than trust. So if you're sitting there wondering why things changed when they were finally going well, understand this. She didn't pull away randomly. Fear was already there, waiting for intimacy to shine a light on it. And sometimes, the very thing that could heal someone is the thing they run from first. Number 5. Your depth required her to show up. Surface love is easy. It flatters. It entertains. It stays light enough that no one has to risk being truly seen. You can laugh, flirt, distract each other, and call it connection. But when you showed up with real depth, when you offered consistency instead of games, presence instead of pressure, emotional strength instead of volatility, you quietly changed the rules of the relationship. And that's usually when fear, the kind that's been there all along, starts to stir. Because depth doesn't just feel good. It asks something in return. When you stayed steady during moments that normally create drama, when you didn't disappear or explode, when you were clear about what you wanted without forcing it, you invited her to meet you at that level. That kind of invitation can feel confronting to someone who's learned to survive emotionally by staying half in, half out. It's not that you demanded too much, it's that your presence made avoidance harder. Think about how this plays out in real life. You didn't rush intimacy, but you didn't run from it either. You were emotionally available without being needy. You showed patience without losing self-respect. Those qualities sound healthy, but to someone still living in emotional turbulence, they can feel destabilizing. Chaos feels familiar. Calm feels suspicious. And when calm starts asking for honesty, accountability, or emotional maturity, fear often chooses distance over growth. From a Stoic perspective, this makes sense. Cleanthes taught that virtue is shaped through resistance, not comfort. And your grounded energy created resistance, not conflict, but contrast. You became a mirror she couldn't easily look away from. Your steadiness highlighted her uncertainty. Your clarity exposed her confusion. That kind of friction doesn't feel romantic to someone who hasn't done the inner work yet. It feels threatening. So when she pulled away, it wasn't random. It wasn't because you lacked something. It was because your depth required her to show up in a way she didn't know how to sustain. And instead of admitting that, fear chose the quieter option: distance. If you're watching this and wondering whether you should have been lighter, less serious, less present, pause right there. Stoicism reminds us that we don't shrink our character to make others comfortable. We stay aligned with who we are and let outcomes fall where they may. Your depth wasn't a mistake. It was a signal. And what it revealed wasn't your inadequacy, it was her unreadiness. You didn't lose her because you were too much. You lost her because you were real. And fear has a way of retreating when it's asked to stand in truth. Take a moment and sit with what you just heard, not to judge it, not to defend yourself, but to really feel it. Ask yourself where you stayed real, even when it would have been easier to stay light, and where that depth may have quietly shifted the dynamic. This isn't about blame, it's about clarity. If any part of this mirrors your own experience, let it surface. I'd like you to reflect on what your presence revealed, not just in her, but in you. And if you're willing, leave a comment sharing what resonated most, or what this stirred inside you. Sometimes naming the truth is the first step toward understanding what comes next. Number 6. She didn't expect you to hold your frame. Maybe she tested you with distance, a slower reply, a shift in tone, a subtle emotional pullback meant to see if you would lean forward, over-explain yourself, or chase reassurance. Most people do. Most people feel the tension and rush to close the gap, afraid of what silence might mean. But you didn't. You stayed centered. You didn't beg. You didn't chase. You didn't collapse into proving your value. And that calm, steady posture wasn't something she was prepared for. This is where the fear had already been sitting quietly. Not fear of you doing something wrong, but fear of what your composure revealed. When someone creates distance, expecting control, and instead meets emotional stability, it disrupts the pattern they're used to. Stoicism teaches that strength is not loud reaction, but disciplined response. And in that moment, your restraint became a mirror. It showed her uncertainty without you saying a word. Think about how unfamiliar that can feel. Distance is often used as a test, sometimes unconsciously. It's a way to measure how much power someone has over you. When that test fails, when there's no panic, no scrambling, no emotional bargaining, it can trigger discomfort. Your calm wasn't coldness, it wasn't indifference, it was direction. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, you don't need to be pulled apart by things outside your control. You choose your stance. You chose to remain grounded. And here's the part most people miss. Holding your frame doesn't just unsettle others, it forces them inward. She may have felt exposed by her own indecision, by the realization that she couldn't move you emotionally the way she expected. That can feel threatening to someone who hasn't made peace with themselves yet. Your steadiness raised an unspoken question she wasn't ready to answer. If he's this calm, without chasing me, what does that say about my position? So if she pulled back further after that, it wasn't random, it wasn't sudden, it was fear responding to structure. You didn't punish her. You didn't withdraw to manipulate. You simply stayed aligned with who you are. And for someone used to emotional turbulence, that kind of grounded presence can feel overwhelming, not because it's wrong, but because it's real. Number 7. Fear of not being enough wins silently. She may have pulled away with no explanation, but inside, her mind was anything but quiet. While you were trying to understand the distance, she was quietly questioning herself. What if I can't meet his standard? What if I fail once he really sees me? What if I'm not as emotionally strong, stable, or consistent as he is? Those questions don't always come from arrogance or indifference. Often, they come from insecurity that doesn't know how to speak honestly. I want you to think about how this shows up in real life. You stayed steady. You didn't pressure her. You didn't play games. You showed up with clarity and presence. And instead of that making her feel safe, it made her feel exposed. Your calm reflected something back to her that she wasn't ready to face. Not because you demanded perfection, but because your standards were quiet, lived, and non-negotiable. That can be intimidating to someone who's used to relationships where expectations are low and chaos fills the gaps. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, lost everything in a shipwreck. His wealth, his certainty, his old identity, gone in a moment. But instead of collapsing, that loss pushed him toward philosophy and inner strength. The Stoics understood something most people miss. Fear doesn't always signal danger. Sometimes it signals transformation. Sometimes it means you're standing at the edge of growth, right before you're asked to rise to a new level of responsibility and self-honesty. And here's the hard truth many people don't want to admit. Growth requires courage. It requires staying when it would be easier to leave. For someone who doubts their worth, walking away feels safer than risking being seen and possibly falling short. So she didn't pull away randomly. Fear was already there, quietly winning every internal argument, convincing her that retreat was protection. If you've ever wondered why things felt good but still fell apart, this is often why. Not because you weren't enough, but because you were enough to force a mirror she wasn't ready to look into. And from a Stoic perspective, your role was never to shrink so she could feel comfortable. Your role was to stay aligned with who you are. What she chose to do with that reflection was always out of your control. Number 8. She saw your standards as pressure. You didn't demand anything from her, and that's the part most people miss. You weren't issuing ultimatums or asking her to become someone she wasn't overnight. But your presence, disciplined, composed, emotionally grounded, created a kind of quiet tension. Not because you were harsh, but because you were clear. And clarity has weight. When someone hasn't fully confronted their own patterns, being around a person who lives with intention can feel like standing under a spotlight. Nothing is said, yet everything is revealed. Think about how this plays out in everyday moments. You didn't over-explain yourself. You didn't chase reassurance. You didn't blur your boundaries just to keep things smooth. You listened, but you didn't abandon yourself. That kind of behavior forces reflection without a single confrontation. It makes someone notice the gaps between who they are and who they know they could be. And for someone who's been avoiding that inner work, that awareness doesn't feel motivating, it feels uncomfortable. Pressure doesn't always come from expectations placed on you. Sometimes it comes from the expectations you place on yourself when you're finally faced with someone solid. This is why the fear didn't show up loudly. It didn't arrive as an argument or a dramatic exit. It surfaced as hesitation, as pulling back, as creating space where closeness once existed. The fear was already there, quietly asking, "What if I can't meet this?" And instead of answering that question honestly, distance became the escape. It's easier to step away than to sit with the realization that growth is required. Stoicism gives you a grounded way to understand this without turning inward with guilt. The Stoics believed that virtue is not something you negotiate to keep others comfortable. Epictetus spoke often about living in accordance with your nature, not bending yourself to avoid friction. Your standards weren't weapons, they weren't judgments. They were simply the result of self-respect. And self-respect has a way of challenging those who haven't fully built it yet. So if you're watching this and questioning whether you should have been more flexible, more accommodating, or less grounded, hear this clearly. Lowering your standards wouldn't have removed her fear. It would have delayed it. Fear doesn't disappear when you shrink yourself, it just changes form. She didn't pull away randomly. She pulled away because staying would have required her to rise to a level she wasn't ready to sustain. And here's the Stoic anchor in all of this. You don't abandon virtue to keep connection. You don't trade alignment for attachment. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, you do what is right and let the outcome follow its own course. If someone steps away when faced with calm strength and clear standards, that distance is not failure. It's information. And the most powerful thing you can do now is remain exactly where you are rooted, composed, and unwilling to apologize for the stability you worked hard to build. Number 9. Her past started echoing again. And this is something most people never talk about. When someone meets steady energy, real consistency, calm presence, emotional reliability, it doesn't just feel good. Sometimes it feels dangerous. Your consistency didn't distract her from her past. It removed the noise that used to keep it quiet. In chaos, old wounds stay buried because there's always something happening. But in calm, there's nowhere for the mind to hide. That's why she didn't pull away randomly. The fear was already there, waiting for stillness to expose it. Think about it from her side for a moment. Every time you showed up the same way, every time you didn't disappear, overreact, or create drama, her nervous system had space to breathe. And in that space, memories returned. Old disappointments. Moments where she felt abandoned, failed, or not enough. Your peace didn't cause those feelings, but it amplified them. Not because you were doing something wrong, but because you weren't doing what chaos usually does: distract. This is where Stoicism quietly explains what happened. Musonius Rufus taught that character is formed through inner confrontation, not comfort. Growth requires facing what we'd rather avoid. And whether you meant to or not, your calm presence invited that confrontation. You weren't pushing her to heal. You weren't demanding answers. You were simply stable. And for someone who learned to survive by adapting, pleasing, or escaping, stability can feel like pressure. Maybe you noticed it in small ways. She started getting distant after moments of closeness. She became quieter when things felt safe. Or she pulled back right when it looked like something real was forming. That wasn't confusion. That was fear responding to reflection. Your consistency was a mirror, and in that mirror she saw parts of herself she wasn't ready to sit with yet. So, if you're watching this, wondering what you did wrong, hear this clearly. You didn't trigger her past. You didn't reopen wounds. You simply stopped masking them with chaos. And when fear meets clarity, fear often chooses distance. That's not a failure on your part. That's the cost of being grounded in a world that survives on emotional noise. Stoicism never teaches us to chase people who retreat from their own reflection. It teaches us to stay aligned with who we are, even when others step away. Your peace didn't push her away randomly. It revealed something she hadn't finished facing. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is remain calm while someone else decides whether they're ready to grow. Before we continue, take a moment to pause with what you just heard. Let it settle instead of rushing to the next explanation or outcome. Ask yourself where in your own life your calm has been misunderstood, or where staying grounded cost you someone who wasn't ready to face themselves. This part of the journey isn't about answers, it's about awareness. If this resonated, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment sharing what stood out to you, or simply type, "My calm is not the problem," to anchor this truth for yourself. And if this perspective is helping you see things more clearly, take a second to like the video so it reaches others who need this reminder too. Number 10. Silence became her shield. You noticed her getting quiet, not cold, just distant. And at first, you blamed yourself. Was it something you said, something you missed? But the more you played back every interaction, the more you realized it wasn't about a mistake you made. That silence? It wasn't calm. It wasn't contemplation. It was protection, her way of escaping a depth she wasn't ready to swim in. You didn't bring chaos into her life, you brought clarity. And clarity has a strange way of making people uncomfortable, especially when they're used to noise, drama, or distraction. Your consistency gave her fewer places to hide emotionally. And that's when silence showed up. Not as peace, but as armor. She couldn't express the fear directly, so she withdrew behind the only thing she could control: distance. Seneca, one of the great Stoic minds, once wrote long, thoughtful letters to Lucilius, a man who, we're told, didn't always write back. But Seneca didn't stop writing because of the silence. He kept speaking truth, not to get a response, but to stay centered in virtue. He knew that wisdom doesn't need applause. In contrast, her silence wasn't rooted in virtue. It was reactive, a way to avoid the pressure of being seen without masks. This kind of silence often gets misread. You might have thought it meant she was thinking, growing, or respecting your space. But often, it's not that deep. Sometimes, it's fear of vulnerability, of not being enough, of losing control. Stoicism teaches us not to chase noise or fear the quiet, but to understand the why behind both. When you do that, you stop personalizing someone else's retreat and start seeing it as what it truly is: a mirror showing where they are emotionally. So if you're sitting there trying to interpret her silence, don't rush to fill in the gaps with self-doubt. Silence doesn't always mean thoughtfulness. Sometimes it means avoidance, and that has nothing to do with your worth. Stoicism reminds us to observe without chasing, to remain steady without forcing clarity from someone who isn't ready to give it. Your role isn't to break through her shield. It's to stay rooted in who you are. When you do that, her silence no longer confuses you. It simply tells you where she is, and why walking forward in peace is the right move. Number 11. It wasn't random, it was revealing. She didn't just change. What happened was quieter, slower, and far more honest than that. She revealed what had been under the surface the whole time. If you look back carefully, the signs were there long before the distance became obvious, the pauses before answering serious questions, the way she kept things light when moments called for depth, the subtle discomfort whenever the connection felt real instead of exciting. That wasn't confusion. That was fear slowly coming into focus. And this matters for you to understand, because when someone pulls away like that, it's easy to make it about your value. But this wasn't a rejection of who you are. It was a reflection of where she was. Think about how this plays out in real life. When you show up steady, consistent, emotionally grounded, you remove the chaos that some people unconsciously rely on. There's nothing to react against, nothing to escape into. And for someone who has learned to survive through emotional instability, that kind of calm can feel unsettling instead of safe. Your presence didn't create her fear, it revealed it. The closer things got, the harder it became for her to hide from the parts of herself she hadn't healed. The Stoics understood this dynamic well. Epictetus said that people are disturbed not by events themselves, but by the meaning they assign to them. You were the event. Not because you did something wrong, but because your clarity forced a decision she wasn't ready to make. Instead of interpreting your steadiness as security, her mind framed it as pressure. Instead of seeing peace, she felt exposed. And when fear doesn't know how to speak honestly, it often chooses silence and distance. I want you to really take this in. Her fear did not mean you failed. It didn't mean you lacked something. It meant you represented a level of emotional responsibility she hadn't yet developed. You didn't rush her. You didn't demand. You didn't force anything. You simply stayed aligned with who you are. And sometimes, that alone is enough to trigger retreat in someone who isn't prepared to grow. This is where Stoicism becomes your anchor. Your peace was never meant to be negotiated. Your strength was never meant to shrink to make someone else comfortable. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily to stand firm in his own nature, regardless of how others reacted. That applies here. You didn't lose something meaningful, you gained clarity. You saw the truth early. And once you understand that her pulling away came from fear that was already there, you stop chasing explanations and stop questioning your worth. You stay grounded, you stay intact. And that, whether she ever realizes it or not, is real strength. If this message hit something in you, take a breath. You're not here to beg for someone who's not ready. You're here to protect your energy, live your truth, and become even more grounded than you were yesterday. She didn't pull away randomly. Fear was already whispering to her long before it reached your ears. So if this gave you a new perspective, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment sharing what part hit hardest. And don't stop here, watch the next video on screen. Let's keep building that inner strength together.